All right, data protection fans, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling Module 1 of the DellEMC Data Protection Solutions course.
Okay, sounds good.
And, I think when people hear data protection, maybe their eyes glaze over a little bit, like how exciting can it really be? But I think we're going to prove them wrong today.
I hope so. Data protection is definitely a critical topic,
Yeah,
and it can be pretty interesting once you dig into it.
I think so too. So let's start with the basics. What are some of the key concepts covered in Module 1 that our listeners, who are maybe starting this course for the first time should really be paying attention to?
Well, I think Module 1 is really all about laying the groundwork. It answers the question of why data protection is so important in the first place. Then it goes into the different types of data we have, production data versus non-production data. And then finally, it introduces the different methods we use to protect that data.
Okay, so that why question is a good place to start. Why is data protection so crucial, especially now when you're generating and using more data than ever before?
Yeah, it's crucial because data is really the lifeblood of any modern organization.
Mm.
It's what gives businesses a competitive edge, helps them make better decisions, and ultimately drives their success.
But what happens if that data is compromised? If it's lost or corrupted or stolen?
Well, the consequences can be pretty severe. It can lead to financial losses, reputational damage, and even legal penalties.
Right. And it's not just about protecting the data itself.
Mhm.
It's also about ensuring that the systems and applications that rely on that data can continue to function, even if something goes wrong.
Exactly. We need to think about things like business continuity and disaster recovery.
Okay, so we're talking about some pretty high stakes here.
Hmm.
So how do we actually go about protecting our data?
Well, Module 1 introduces this concept called the CIA triad, which stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
Yeah.
And these are really the three core pillars of data protection.
Okay, so let's break those down. Confidentiality. I guess that means keeping sensitive data, private,
Hmm.
keeping it away from unauthorized access.
Yeah, exactly. It involves things like encryption access controls and strong authentication mechanisms.
Okay, and what about integrity?
Integrity is all about ensuring that the data is accurate and hasn't been tampered with or altered in any way.
So like if we're talking about financial transactions,
Yeah,
we want to be sure that the amounts haven't been changed
Yeah.
or that the records haven't been manipulated,
exactly. And then finally, we have availability.
which I guess means making sure that the data is accessible to authorized users when they need it.
Exactly. You need to make sure that the data is available when and where it's needed, even if there's a system failure or a natural disaster.
And this is where those metrics we hear about all the time, RPO and RTO, come into play, right?
That's right. RPO stands for Recovery Point Objective, and it basically defines how much data loss a business can tolerate.
So if your RPO is 4 hours, that means you can afford to lose up to 4 hours worth of data in a worst-case scenario.
Correct. And then RTO stands for Recovery Time Objective, and that defines how long it can take to restore data and systems after an outage.
Okay, so RPO is about how much data we can afford to lose, and RTO is about how long we can afford to be down.
Exactly. And these metrics are crucial for designing an effective data protection strategy.
Okay, so we've talked about the why and the how of data protection. Now let's dive into the different types of data. Module 1 talks about production versus non-production data. You explain the difference?
Sure, production data is basically the live data that's actively being used by your applications and systems. It's the data that's mission critical for running your business.
So like customer data, financial records, inventory information, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And because it's so critical, this data needs to be stored on high-performance storage systems that are fast, reliable, and highly available.
Okay, what about non-production data?
Non-production data is essentially any data that's not actively being used by applications. This could include things like backups, archives, test data, development data, and so on.
So it's kind of like the data that's on the sidelines waiting to be called into action, or maybe it's been retired from active duty.
That's a good analogy. And because non-production data isn't as critical as production data, it can typically be stored on less expensive storage systems that may not be as fast or as highly available.
All right, so within non-production data, we have things like backups, archives, and replicas. Let's start with backups. What exactly is a backup, and why is it so important for data protection?
Well, a backup is essentially a copy of your data that's stored separately from your production systems. And it's important because it provides a safety net in case something happens to your primary data.
So if your production data is lost or corrupted, you can restore it from your backup.
That's right. It's like having an insurance policy for your data.
And how are backups typically stored?
Well, there are a few different ways to store backups, but they're typically stored on some type of secondary storage system. This could be a dedicated backup appliance, a tape library, or even cloud storage.
And Module 1 mentions something called the backup window and the recovery window. What are those?
Yeah, the backup window is the time period during which the backup is being created. And this can vary depending on the size of the data set and the speed of the backup system.
So if you have a lot of data to back up, it could take several hours or even days to complete the backup.
Exactly. And then the recovery window is the time it takes to restore the data from the backup.
So if you need to restore a large amount of data, it could take a while.
Right. And when it comes to backups, the RPO and RTO tend to be a bit higher than with other data protection methods.
Meaning there's more potential for data loss and downtime.
That's right. But backups are still a very important part of any data protection strategy. So we've talked about backups. Now let's move on to archives. How are archives different from backups?
Yeah, so archives are kind of like backups, but they're designed for long-term data retention. They're typically used for data that's not actively being used, but still needs to be kept for regulatory or compliance reasons.
Right. Think about things like financial records or medical records that need to be kept for a certain number of years.
Exactly. So with archives, we're not as concerned about the recovery time because we don't expect to need to access that data very often.
That's right. The focus with archives is more on ensuring that the data is preserved securely and can be retrieved if needed.
Okay, that makes sense. So backups are for short-term recovery and archives are for long-term retention. Got it.
Exactly. Now let's talk about replicas.
Okay, replicas, those are interesting because Module 1 mentions that they can actually reside on production storage, which I thought was kind of weird.
Yeah, it can seem counterintuitive,
Yeah.
but replicas on production storage are actually quite common. They're used to provide fast recovery in case of a server or storage failure.
So it's like having a spare copy of your data right there on your production system ready to go if something goes wrong.
Exactly. And there are two main types of replication, local and remote.
Okay, so local replication is when you're replicating data within the same data center or even the same storage system.
Right. And it's typically used for disaster recovery purposes. Like if one server fails, you can quickly switch over to the replica and keep your applications running.
What about remote replication?
Remote replication is when you're replicating data to a different location. This could be another data center in a different city or even a different country.
And that's typically used for disaster recovery as well, right? Like if
Yeah.
there's a major outage at your primary data center, you can fail over to your secondary site.
Exactly. And within those categories of local and remote replication, you also have different types of replication technologies like synchronous replication and asynchronous replication.
Okay, can you explain the difference between those?
Sure, synchronous replication is when the data is replicated in real time. So every change that's made to the source data is immediately replicated to the target.
So there's virtually no data loss in case of a failure.
Right. Asynchronous replication, on the other hand, is when the data is replicated with a slight delay. So there's a potential for some data loss if the source system fails before the changes have been replicated.
Okay, that makes sense. So synchronous replication is like a live mirror of your data, whereas asynchronous replication is more like a delayed mirror.
Exactly. And the choice of which replication technology to use depends on a number of factors, like the distance between the source and target systems, the required RPO and RTO, and the available bandwidth.
Right, so replicas are really about ensuring that you have a copy of your data available at all times, whether it's for disaster recovery purposes or for other reasons.
That's right. And they can also be used to create copies of your backups or archives in a secondary location.
So it's like having a backup of your backup.
Exactly. This provides an extra layer of protection in case your primary backup site is unavailable.
Wow. So we've covered a lot of ground here with backups, archives, and replicas. It seems like there are a lot of different ways to protect our data.
There are, and the best approach is really going to depend on the specific needs of your organization.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. But the key takeaway is that data protection is essential for any organization that relies on data to run its business.
So much to consider when it comes to data protection, huh? It's really a multifaceted challenge.
It is. There's so much to think about, from the types of data you have to the different protection methods available, and then the various factors like RPO and RTO that need to be taken into account.
And it's not just about technology either, right? There's a human element to it as well, like making sure that your employees understand the importance of data protection and that they're following proper procedures.
Absolutely. Data protection is a shared responsibility. It's not just up to the IT department to protect the data. Everyone in the organization has a role to play.
So what's the one key message that you hope our listeners take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is that data protection should be a top priority for any organization in today's world. It's not something that you can afford to ignore or put on the back burner.
Because the consequences of not protecting your data can be pretty severe.
Exactly. And the good news is that there are so many resources available to help you develop and implement a solid data protection strategy. There's really no excuse for not having one in place.
So where should someone start if they're feeling a bit overwhelmed by all of this?
I would say start by assessing your current data protection posture. What kind of data do you have? Where is it stored? How is it being protected?
And then from there, you can start to identify any gaps or weaknesses in your strategy.
Right. And there are lots of great frameworks and best practices out there that you can use to guide you, like the NIST cybersecurity framework or the ISO 27001 standard.
And of course, there are lots of vendors and consultants who can help you as well if you need additional expertise.
Exactly. Data protection is a complex topic, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming. With a little bit of planning and effort, you can put yourself in a good position to protect your organization's most valuable asset.
Well said. And that's a great note to end on, I think. So thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into Module 1 of the DellEMC Data Protection Solutions course. It's been a really informative and engaging discussion.
It has. My pleasure. I always enjoy talking about data protection, and I hope our listeners found it helpful.
I'm sure they did. And to all of you out there who are just starting your data protection journey, keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay vigilant because in today's world, data is everything.